Mike Williams and Emmanuel Smith from the Department of Human Rights here to present for us. And I guess you can let them know how you want to handle questions and stuff like that as well.
Well, my main idea was we could have a section for questions at the end, but of course we're here to address your needs as an organization and your questions, and so please feel free to chime in at any time with a specific question you have on whatever we're going over at the moment. So hopefully you'll have a way to do that, and I'll answer questions, or Mike can chime in and answer your questions as best we can.
We want to use the raise hand tool.
Yep, so if you want to use the raise hand tool, it'll be being monitored, so we should be able to get you unmuted and you can ask your question. But we'll definitely unmute everybody at the end so we can get all necessary questions taken care of. All right. We're good to go? Awesome. Well, I guess the first question is, what are we all here to discuss? Obviously, for me, I'm a person with a disability. I was born with a disability. I grew up under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is certainly through my life has been one of the most impactful pieces of legislation ever passed. My ability to go to school, my ability to fully interact with my community here in Iowa, to access all the wonderful services provided by state government here, that's all intertwined with what we'll be talking about today, the Rehabilitation Act as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think it's very easy to forget the human impact of impersonal legislation, because it can feel kind of extensive and it can get a little difficult when you get into the minutia of it. But it has a profound human impact on people's lives, and for me personally. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen about what the law has done for millions of Americans with disabilities, and hopefully we can kind of tailor the presentation today to your needs as an organization as you move forward and as you begin to integrate disability services more into what you're going to be doing as an organization. How did the ADA come about? I think that's a really important question to understand exactly what the foundation of the bill is and what its main purpose is. Obviously, for a very long time, people with disabilities were largely excluded from their community in a variety of ways, and also excluded from the benefits of full citizenship. We didn't have access to all the services that our government provided, and we didn't have access to the benefit of being a member of the larger community. And so it really was a slow but steady progress towards full inclusion of people with disabilities. And so that's been a slow and measured march towards a more inclusive society. And a big part of that movement towards inclusion was the passage of the Rehabilitation Act in the 1970s, which is an important precursor to the ADA, and of course still is in effect today and is strengthened by the ADA, not undermined by it. But it really it mandated the inclusion of people with disabilities in government services, which allowed people with disabilities to finally begin to fully benefit from all these different government programs. Program access, and obviously for my own personal example, integration into education. For the longest time, people with disabilities were segregated out of the traditional educational experience. So regardless of our disabilities, regardless of our unique needs, we were just segregated from the normal student population. So for me, for example, when I was attending high school, I had a 504 plan, which was an individualized approach to my needs as a student in order to allow me to fully benefit from the great educational system we have here in Iowa. That came directly out of the requirements established in the Rehabilitation Act. And so regardless of what kinds of services you provide as an organization, the first push towards addressing the needs of people with disabilities came from the Rehabilitation Act. And you'll see it again largely mirrored in many ways in what we'll be talking about in Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's not going away. it's a persistent call towards the inclusion of people with disabilities in governmental services. And then, of course, moving towards the ADA, which is one of the largest civil rights piece of civil rights legislation ever passed. It was, obviously bolstered by the fact that by passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it was a precursor to really addressing large-scale instances of discrimination against certain subsets of the American people. So it's moving on from there, the ADA began as a grassroots movement of people with disabilities who were sick of being excluded from all elements of society and sick of being excluded from governmental services and denied opportunity. And so the fact that the ADA was passed was really an incredible thing because it is a remarkable piece of legislation. It was finally passed in July 26th of 1990, and obviously here in Iowa, we, at least certainly members of my community, the community of people with disabilities, Senator Tom Harkin played a very large part in getting that piece of legislation passed. And it's had a tremendous impact on the lives of people with disabilities. As I've already said a little bit, I grew up under the protections of this law, which has allowed me to get a full education, allowed me to benefit from things like vocational rehabilitation, and just allowed me to get around in my own community, which I don't think you can understate how big of an impact that's had on my life and the lives of people with disabilities. And so to take the time to really understand the law, that law, what it does, and how it impacts your work, I really appreciate. And so hopefully we can kind of shed a little light on what that law attempts to do, how it's changed, and then more directly, what obligations does it create for your agency. The fundamental element of the ADA is to provide a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and to provide a clear, strong, consistent, enforceable standard addressing discrimination against individuals with disabilities. It's a very, very broad piece of legislation, and intentionally so. It was meant to attack all the different areas of disability discrimination, not focus in on one area over another. And so that broadness, I think, can make it a very intimidating piece of legislation to learn about, because it does have so many facets and because it does have so many areas that it tries to address. Obviously, for this presentation, we're going to be focusing primarily on Title II, because that's obviously what's going to pertain most to your work, but we'll get a little bit into every element of the ADA. It's also important to note that the ADA is meant to be strongly defended by the federal government and really allow for Congress to aggressively make sure that this piece of legislation is enforced. And I think it's very easy to get a misunderstanding and to begin to think of the Americans with Disabilities Act as a piece of legislation that encourages affirmative action or special privilege. That's not really the case. It does establish people with disabilities as a protected class of people who traditionally face discrimination, but it's not meant to give advantages to some people over others. It's meant to provide an equal playing field, an equal opportunity for success, an equal opportunity to access services, engage in government, engage in our community. And so that's the aim. And so I would really encourage you to not see many of these provisions as special privileges, but an attempt to create an environment in which we can all succeed. So I think that's a really important distinction, because sometimes the ADA can get misinterpreted in that way. Like I said earlier, the ADA is very, very broad. So we're going to go title by title into the different ways that the ADA attempts to address discrimination. Title I deals primarily with employment to provide reasonable accommodations for applicants and employees with disabilities and prohibit discrimination on the basis of a disability in all aspects of employment. And these accommodations can include all sorts of things, be it in the application process or once I've been hired, reasonable accommodations to allow me to do my job to the fullest, and just really creating an environment in which I can succeed as an employee. So it regulates all manner of interactions between employers and employees, especially employees with disabilities, that is. So I think it's useful to use a personal example in order to understand how this title affects interactions. So when I went into for my first job, I went into to apply to a movie theater. And in that initial discussion with my potential employer, he wasn't able to ask me in-depth questions about my disability. He wasn't able to request medical documentation. He wasn't able to, hit on that point again and again and again and look for any reason to not consider me a potential candidate. Really, the only question was, am I able to do the fundamental elements of the job I was applying for? That's really the only relevant question and only legal question. He did ask that question, I answered yes, and we moved on. That was really the only way in which we touched on the issue of my disability. Once I was hired, I entered into different protections under Title I of the ADA. Protections like, in order to do my job, to make my job much easier, I asked that the bin of 3D glasses were moved from one location to another, so I could reach it easier for people coming to the movie theater. Very minor adjustments like that. And a vast majority of accommodations in the workplace for people with disabilities cost very, very little. I think most are free. They're just simple modifications of policy or practices that allow people with disabilities to be full and great employees. And so thankfully, because of Title I was able to be a good movie theater employee. So Title I really is about employment and getting people with disabilities into opportunities that they had for a good long time been denied. So that's why Title I is incredibly important. Title II we're going to spend a little bit more time on because obviously Title II is the one that's most relevant to your work. Title II mirrors the Rehabilitation Act in many ways, and that it begins to mandate the accessibility of government programs and government services. And so under Title II, public services, including state and local government agencies, cannot deny services to people with disabilities or deny participation in programs or activities that are available to people without disabilities. In addition, public transportation systems, such as public transit buses, must be accessible to individuals with disabilities. Title II, it really is important for me because it's a real detriment to feel like you're not a full citizen and that you're not getting the same equal access to all the incredible things that our government does. And so for your work here at the Department of Aging, I'm sure you provide all manner of great services, whether you're contracting it out or you're providing it in-house. I'm sure there's a vast variety of ways that you help the population here in Iowa. And so it's always really sad to see people with disabilities not able to access those great services on an equal level as people without disabilities. And so there are a variety of the requirements that were put in place in order to make sure that that didn't happen, in order to make sure that your services were getting where they were sometimes needed the most. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over in a little bit greater detail than we are in the other titles of the ADA on what those requirements are and how you can kind of keep them in the back of your mind as you're going through all your work and establishing policy and establishing new services. This is especially important for your department, obviously, because the elderly population has a higher chance of being protected under the ADA. You're going to encounter this a lot. You're going to encounter, interpretive issues. You're going to encounter accessibility issues. And so it's important to really have at least some base level of understanding of the ADA and what it offers, what protections it offers for people with disabilities. And I think it's also really important to, when you're designing new programs or designing new services or looking to implement something new, consider these issues first before you implement that plan. It's always easier to build it into whatever policy you're creating or whatever decision you're making, rather than after the fact realizing that you've accidentally excluded a section of the population. So these kind of considerations that we're going to be going through here in a second, I think are good to keep actively juggle around as you're making these decisions and doing your work. So here's probably the simplest thing in the world: to deny denial of service, simply not allowing somebody with a disability to access the services you provide for no reason other than ignorance or just basic assumptions. And it's that's hopefully not going to happen very often. That's a very basic protection. A good example of that is, let's say you're having a meeting open to the public in your department, and then somebody comes and you assume they look like they might have a mental illness, and so you don't allow them to go to the meeting because you assume they'll be disruptive. That's discriminatory. That has no basis in any sound consideration, and so that's the most basic element of discrimination that Title II would prohibit. Equal participation. If you're having a public forum, a large public forum to discuss a policy, a new policy in the Department of Aging, and somebody comes who is deaf, how is that person going to be able to voice their opinions, engage in discourse with the people running the forum, and really be full participants without interpretive services? So allowing for those kind of accommodations ahead of time. And like, for example, when you're posting the notice for the forum, putting a contact information of somebody that can be called in order to set up interpretive services. Things of that nature, so that people are able to fully participate in that exchange of ideas that oftentimes has a big impact on how you proceed as an organization. Obviously, employment discrimination is a big part of this, and that's probably going to come up more in HR. But when you're looking at new prospective clients, new prospective employees coming into your department, obviously you can't dismiss people out of hand because they would appear to be incapable of doing the job that you have in place. And that comes up again and again in the Americans with Disabilities Act, really combating assumption and misinformation and just blanket judgments without any real thought process behind it. It's important to take the time to ask questions, basic questions of can you fulfill the obligations of this job, and that's as far as it needs to go. Because to assume and to not give somebody an opportunity based off that assumption is obviously, not only is it wrong, but it's against Title II in this case. And then also, of course, program accessibility, which is a little tricky, and we'll get into the more detail of what that means here in a second. But just the idea that any services you offer to the public, to the senior population here in Iowa, you need to make that open to every person, even if they have a disability. And determining accessibility of that program can get a little tricky. So we'll get into what exactly that means here in a second. I'm kind of predisposed to say unfortunately, but physical accessibility is not necessarily mandated under Title II. It's really more about program access. A good example would be if I'm going to the library, I can't reach every book on the shelf. That's just something I'm not able to do. So let's say that I go to the head librarian and I say, I want you to make every shelf of this library 3 feet tall so I can reach every single book. That's not going to fly. And the reason that's not going to fly is because they can provide me program access without doing something as rash as redoing every bookcase in the library. I can go to a librarian, I can ask them to help me grab a book. Now the caveat is they need to be able to do that for me every moment that that library is open, right? They can't set times of accessibility or access if they're not sending that to everybody else. So you do have a little leeway in the ways that you provide services, get those services to people. But you need to make sure they're available in the same window that you provide everybody else. But there are cases in which physical accessibility and program accessibility are just intertwined, and they come hand in hand, and to not be able to get to a location would equal lack of access to a program. There are examples of that, and in cases of that, that's when you get into needing to have an accessible area. Also, of course, if you're building a new government building, if you're doing a major addition onto a government building, that's when you get into accessibility issues, which I believe there's a choice of which standards you can look to, but it's the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards or the ADA AG, which can lay out accessibility guidelines. But that's primarily in new constructions and instances in which you're doing renovations onto older properties. Here's another tricky one, eligibility criteria. A public accommodation may not impose eligibility criteria that either screen out or tend to screen out persons with disabilities from access to offered goods, services, privileges, advantages, or accommodations. Here's a good example. I don't have a driver's license. I have a state ID. If I go to rent a canoe from the Parks Department and they require a driver's license, I give them my state ID and they say, no, we need a driver's license. That's not going to work. Obviously I have the right to have access to that service, and by linking it with a driver's license, they're effectively excluding a big chunk of the population. Little eligibility requirements like that create massive gaps in accessibility. And so it's important to actively look for unintentional ways in which you're excluding people from the programs you're offering. And also, when you see those those blind spots that you're accidentally creating, correct it quickly and effectively. So that things of that nature. Here's another important distinction. The ADA is never going to force either private business or a state entity to create a policy that's unsafe. Obviously, there's certainly safety concerns, and the state and also private entities have a clear interest in keeping their consumers safe. And so a public accommodation may impose legitimate safety requirements necessary for safe operations. Obviously, any time that you reject an accommodation due to safety concerns, you need to have a clear rationale behind it. A lot of times we'll see examples of businesses and even state entities claiming a safety concern without really having any rationale behind it. They'll just blanketly say, due to safety reasons, we can't honor this request. You really have to have some clear thought process behind any safety regulation. And of course, the state retains the right to, give licensing and protect the public good, and they're, creating standards for getting those licenses. Another good example I could think of would be, let's say you have a state park that has a nice little, waterfall in it. And the park has a policy of you need to be X amount of feet away from the waterfall. Well, if somebody with a visual impairment says, well, I can't really see the waterfall, I'd like to go a little bit closer so I can see. Well, obviously, safety trumps accessibility in that case, and you wouldn't have any obligation to modify that policy. The ADA, at a fundamental level, is designed to be inclusive and designed to allow people to participate in every aspect of their community. And so it's really, I'm sad that, you see a lot of these unnecessary inquiries that people encounter time and time again that really make life very difficult. Something that I encounter a fair amount is people have service animals. There really is a misconception that you need to have, all the right documentation on hand, and you have to have the dog and the correct vest and in the right, harness and all those things in order to bring it into a government building or bring it into a private business. And that's really not the case. The ADA really encourages and manages that we err on the side of personal dignity. And so if the animal isn't causing a disturbance, and if the animal is clean and not really disturbing the runnings of the establishment, it's really important that you just assume that the person is using it, their service animal, and take it on face value. So if you go up to somebody that have an animal and they say it's a service animal, you can't be interrogating them, asking for justification after justification after justification. Obviously, be it state or private, if the dog is causing a disturbance or isn't well kept and it's just creating an unsafe or unpleasant environment, at that point you of course have every right to ask the animal to leave with the owner, because the owner, regardless of whether it's a service animal or not, they have an obligation to keep the dog under control and also keep it clean and well kept. So it's really trying to limit the burden of proof that I think a lot of people like to put on our community, and asking an overabundance of questions that really aren't necessary. Other areas that I think are important for you to keep in mind, providing an equal means of communication. If you're going to have, let's say you have somebody coming into your department to discuss one service or another, and again, they're deaf. You can't just say, oh, well, Jenny, a couple cubicles over, knows a little bit of sign. I bet she can make this work. That's not going to do it. Sign is a very, very complicated language, both in interpreting it into speech and, interpreting the speech back into sign. That's a really intricate process, and it's really necessary to have somebody there who understands the complexity of it. So unless you're having a really short interaction, I think it's important that you get the interpretive services in order to make sure that person is able to fully access whatever service you're offering. It's when you have all these consumers of state services, you really should, more often than not, look to them to give you ideas of how to accommodate to their needs. There can be a little bit of a discussion of the most effective way of finding that middle ground and finding that accommodation that works for what's feasible and what's affordable and all that. You can have a little bit of discussion, but it's really important to acknowledge and, whenever possible, make the accommodation in the form that is requested. Because obviously the person with a disability knows their disability best. They know what works best for them. And so, I'm not trying, it's not about creating an undue burden on your department. It's about acquiescing to their needs, if at all possible. And it's also, this is something that's, I think, missed quite a bit, is you need to provide a way for people with disabilities to issue complaints about inaccessibility. And a lot of departments don't do this. If I go onto your website, it's probably a good idea to have a way for people with disabilities to express an issue that they're having on accessibility. Because it's frustrating enough to not feel like you have full access to a government service. You can't imagine how even more frustrating it is when you go to, find somebody to talk to about that issue and then have no way of doing it, not knowing where to look. So that's one of the obligations that's set up under Title II. Here's another really big issue. Do you have a designated person to deal with Title II issues? That's another thing you need to have established. Mandating a clear transition plan is important. That often goes overlooked. And not only having that plan available to the public. Because oftentimes you might have policies or have made assumptions that you didn't even know, just out of lack of understanding. Nobody understands every element of every disability. And so by having it out there and available to the public, you can have public feedback and have, feedback from individual communities that might have issues with your conclusions. And so also, of course, for safety concern, evacuation plans for people with disabilities. If you have somebody in your library on the second floor and, the fire alarm goes off, how are you going to help that person get to safety? Or what's the plan? Having at least bare minimum a plan in place. All those things are very, very basic and also very, very important, I think, for really providing full inclusion for people with disabilities. We'll move on here to Title III, which you obviously won't encounter as much, but it's public accommodations, including facilities such as restaurants, hotels, grocery stores, retail stores, etc., as well as privately owned transportation systems. Title III requires that all new construction and modifications must be accessible to individuals with disabilities. For existing facilities, various services must be removed if readily achievable. I could, go on for an hour and a half specifically on Title III because it does have a pretty deep qualifications of what mandates accessibility, what mandates, what does readily accessible mean, what's doable, what isn't. So we won't go too in-depth into this title because I know you're not going to encounter it as often as you will Title II. But certainly for my own life, Title III is incredibly important as it's what allows me to go to a movie theater and have an accessible seat, access, go to a restaurant and really engage in my community in a meaningful way. And so I think never forget how important this title is in really creating a community in which everybody is included. Obviously, access to government services is important, but so too is accessing the services that everybody here should be able to benefit from. Here's the Department of Human Rights, Office of Persons with Disabilities. We do all sorts of stuff. Obviously, we can do trainings. We oversee state leases. We really address a lot of different areas of disability discrimination, and also we can be a really good resource of getting you to the right people. I've kind of referred to myself as an operator sometimes. I might not have the answer for you, but 9 times out of 10, I know the person to get you to in order to answer your question. So, obviously we'll have our contact information here at the end and some other resources that are good to have at your disposal. But if you have a disability issue with your programming and with some service you're offering, let us know, and we can find the right person to talk to you to help you fix that as quickly as possible. there are some lesser titles of the ADA that don't really have as huge of amount of regulations behind it. But obviously, Title IV deals with telecommunications, offering telephone services to the general public, and having, the teletype or similar devices for people who have auditory challenges. I know that's particularly important for Senator Harkins because of a family member that benefited greatly from it. And this is a miscellaneous title. It's kind of a catch-all. It's got a lot of different elements to it. I think the most important element to it, though, of course, is the provision against retaliation, particularly pertaining to Title I. So, for example, if I go to my boss and request an accommodation, and then he fires me 2 weeks later, it doesn't really do me much good to have that accommodation written into law if then as soon as I make the request, he can dismiss me. So it's really creating another layer of protection that allows me to fully utilize the titles that we talked about earlier. Here's another really big issue anytime we talk about the ADA. How do we define people with disabilities? And I think it's important to understand that the ADA was deliberately written ambiguously. It was written in a way that's supposed to create a very big umbrella under which all manner of disabilities can fall. Because obviously the more language you include, the more specific you get, the more and more people you're accidentally excluding. And so it was written in a way that's, written in order to look at it from a case-by-case basis, and that a person with a disability is an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of his major life activities, or record that impairment or perceived impairment. Here. So of course, substantially limits primarily deals with, a major life activity. So, and a major life activity are activities that an average person can perform with little or no difficulty. The ADA has changed a lot over time. Obviously, with any piece of legislation, it's going to be interpreted by the courts, and that's, refines the legislation and refines the bill. And so, unfortunately, after the ADA was passed, the courts began to really hit on the issue of who is disabled and who isn't. And they made a much more intensive process to get categorized as disabled than it was meant to be. And so the ADA Amendments Act was really passed in order to create an easier definition of disability and one that didn't allow for an in-depth look into somebody's medical history or something in order to determine that. It's largely supposed to be a common sense approach. And that amendment was passed back in 2008, and it really strengthened the ADA and allow it to be as inclusive as it was written to be. So again, we look to sort of substantially limited. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but a common sense standard of affecting a major life activity and looking as a case by case basis and not making these sweeping generalizations or judgments of this group isn't disabled and this group isn't. And there are a lot of fundamental principles behind the ADA, primarily one being of equal participation and access to benefits and services, which again gets back to Title II and Title III. One of, I think, the biggest driving forces behind the ADA is the desire to create a society in which allows people with disabilities to be a member of the mainstream. Because for a very long time, people with disabilities were largely excluded from the day-to-day activities of our communities. And so the ADA has gone a long way towards moving towards inclusion and allowing people with disabilities to benefit from all the services, opportunities, and great joys of living in this community. So again, it gets back to integration, not creating separate programs unless absolutely necessary, be it privately or publicly, excluding people from services or benefits that our government offers. Real quick before we get into questions, I wanted to show you 3 resources that I think will be useful. One is there we go. The Title II Technical Assistance Manual, which is pretty in-depth, but it allows a very clear understanding of the requirements under Title II. And so if you have any questions on a specific issue, this is the place to go, because it can, in a pretty clear way, it will address any question you might have. Another one, a great one, is the organization that funds my internship, which is Great Plains ADA Center, which really provides a variety of services, but more than anything else, it's information resource. So you're within their the variety of states they serve. So if you have any questions at all, you can email them. They have a variety of ways you can contact them here on the site and explain your situation, explain your policy, and they'll give you a very clear answer of whether or not you're in compliance with Title II. So you don't need to pore over, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can really use these resources because they were established to provide an unbiased answer to any ADA questions you might have. And the last one was a general purpose toolkit for state and local governments. All kinds of stuff. Informational resources. It goes through the basics of the ADA. There's accessibility checklists and surveys, and really a huge wealth of information that, if you're looking to address a specific issue, odds are it'll be here on the toolkit site. So just to summarize real quick, the ADA was a gigantic piece of civil rights legislation that really enabled people with disabilities to become full members of our society and get the full benefits of being American citizens. And it's had a tremendous impact on my life. It's hard for me to articulate the full amount of ways that it shaped what opportunities I've been able to benefit from, and I wouldn't have had this legislation not been passed. And it does create an obligation on state entities to look towards accessibility and really address any areas in which they're not fully offering services to every Iowan. And this, obviously, you have this real great need here to understand the ADA and what it mandates, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to learn the basics of it. Obviously, an hour is a pretty short amount of time to talk about a law that was written over years and years and has tons and tons of different areas to it. So just taking the time to learn the basics of it, I really appreciate. And I think we have, right on time, 15 minutes to kind of do some more in-depth stuff here. We have Mike Williams here from the Office of Persons with Disabilities, who's been doing this for a long time, so he's ready to go, and he's got answers for you. If you have any specific questions, I can help out too, and we'll get it figured out, or like I said, we'll get you to the right people. So if there are any issues you want to bring up, or any challenges you're facing right now, or really anything at all that's not clear, go for it. We got 15 minutes, and we can tackle anything.
And I think we're unmuting everybody. So if you have questions. There's a little too much feedback. We're going to mute you all, and if if you could raise your hand if you have questions, and we'll unmute you one at a time. Okay. I think Beth, you had a question?
Yes. If someone is using illegal drugs, are they considered disabled?
That's a great question. Absolutely not. The ADA is very, very clear. If you're using a legal substance, you are not disabled and you do not benefit from any of these protections. A couple of things to remember, though. As soon as the person is no longer using illegal drugs and is a recovering addict, then they are generally considered disabled and therefore given the protections. Alcoholism is considered a disability. Now, just because somebody has a disability does not excuse them from the general requirements of the job. That's important to remember too. So even if you have somebody who is recovering from substance abuse, if they're not meeting the requirements of their job, not getting to work on time or whatever issue you're having, they still need to be held accountable for that. Is that pretty clear?
This is actually, I'm asking in relationship to a client.
Okay.
And the safety of the worker going into the home and whether or not we can deny service in the home based on active illegal drug use. Or are we bound to provide the service because...
I would say no, you're not bound to provide the service, and you'd want to look at your specific department policy on how you offer your programs and services to individuals, because obviously you don't go into any situation that's going to cause, that could cause any danger or do anything detrimental to the person going in to provide that service.
Right.
So whatever you guys have set in your policy is what you need to follow.
Right. And safety is always a concern. You have the right to protect your people off the services.
Do you have any other questions? I wanted to mention from another presentation I went to, my understanding is that one thing that employers and service providers worry about is that they assume that in order to accommodate people, it's going to be very expensive.
Right.
And that generally speaking, for the great majority of cases, it's a tremendously inexpensive kind of a fix.
Very much so. Especially that I think the main place that comes up is in employment, obviously. People often will not hire people with disabilities because they assume they're going to have a laundry list of accommodations that are going to cost thousands of dollars and all those things. That's really not the case. Most of the time, a lot of these accessibility issues can be addressed with common sense. Are we doing something that is easily fixed that would allow people with disabilities to have much easier access to the services we provide? So, common sense always trumps, billfold in taking care of these issues.
And I was just wanting to kind of clarify the definition of disability. So
Yeah.
if we're serving people with disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
how would we be, I know you touched on this when you were in your presentation, but how would we be looking at, when would we determine that they have a disability? When is it
Well,
specifically?
that's always going to be one of the areas that's kind of tricky about the ADA, right? Is how do we figure out if people are disabled or not? The key is a disability is anything that interferes with a major life function, right? So something that it's very hard for me, that for most people is easiest thing in the world. And the major life functions list is pretty long. And the scope of disability is pretty extensive. So, but again, common sense comes in big play. If somebody has a very significant limp because of an injury, that's that's going to be a long-term injury. That's probably a disability, or even things like digestion, or like for me, ambulatory or auditory. It's such a huge scale. So if you're really trying to figure out if somebody has a disability or not, think about how does their issue impact their life, and does it create a limitation where for most people it would be a very, very simple thing. So it's hard to say because it's such deliberately created to be an individualized thing. So I could definitely talk through any example you give me of how do we look at the person, but it's really got to be an individualized assessment.
And with regards to Title II, which is the employment piece, obviously an employee or a potential employee would have to self-disclose if they needed an accommodation or something of that nature. Obviously, if someone comes in with a wheelchair or is physically blind and those types of things, those are obvious, and you can handle those accordingly with a common sense situation. But you can't always assume, and as Emmanuel has said throughout the presentation, it's all case by case, because one person's disability could be very similar to someone else's disability, but how you handle it and how things go are completely different. So it's case by case. And that's where you engage the employee in that particular process to see what's going to work out the best. With regard to clients or clientele, obviously you're trying to provide a service to either enhance their life or make something work out better for them to live independently, whatever it may be. And that's, of course, where you take in, again, that whole common sense piece where, what is going to work the best to make sure that this person is getting the services, acquiring the services, and able to utilize the services that we're able to offer. So in that perspective, I think it's okay to have a broader dialogue and talk about, what are your needs, what's working here, what isn't working. If there's some visual impairments, if someone isn't maybe responding to things that are pamphlets, things that are written, things that are emailed, that type of thing, you can work on those. There might be some cognitive issues as we age. So, are people are they understanding what's being said or some of the services that are going on? So, it's all, again, just a case-by-case situation, but you can have a much broader perspective when you're dealing with a client versus when you're in Title I of that employment perspective.
That's like I said, that's a very narrow question that you get to ask, and beyond that, it's not, minimize assumption. For clients, if you're concerned about a client that may or may not be able to fully access your services, it's really look to them to tell you what they need. And like I said, don't assume they have this kind of disability and therefore need this or need that. Just allow for that flexibility so that you're aware of any issues that might come up and you can accommodate as needed. Okay.
Kim, you have a question?
Oh, sure. This is Kim, and I'm a local long-term care ombudsman. And so we go into long-term care facilities and assisted living, group homes, and so forth. And I'm wondering, would you be a resource for us to be able to call if we run across a situation where one of our residents or tenants we feel is not being accommodated with their disability?
We would, and like I said, we can get you the right people, good advocacy organizations, or like Disability Rights Iowa deals with a lot of those issues.
Right.
People with disabilities who are not getting the services they need. Absolutely, you can call our office, and we can get you talking to the kinds of people who address those issues they're living.
Would you, I think a lot of times we run into situations that have to do with the buildings themselves.
Right,
Would you be a resource for that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Mike's done that for a lot, a good long time. He's got that down.
Okay, thank you very much.
And as far as the best contact information, because I know it may not be you guys personally, but if they would just contact the Department on Human
Well,
Rights?
yeah, the number is there at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
888-219-0471, and that typically goes to my desk, and or we have a receptionist as well that picks up those phone calls.
Yeah.
So,
And we can definitely get, once you explain any issue you might be having, we can definitely get you a list of different organizations and different good people who are there to talk to.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right. This webinar has been recorded, and we are planning to have it online for anybody that needs to reference it later for people who couldn't be here today. Also, please feel free to contact me to give me feedback or ideas for other webinars. We're planning to do some additional ones in the future. And I'd just really like to thank Mike Williams and Emmanuel Smith for taking the time to do this for us.
thanks for having us.
So much for having us.